I must say, for anybody who's given a talk at a thing like this, you might be familiar with the effect that you're asked in sort of April to come up with a title for a talk. What seems like a great title in April, by the time you get to October, can seem like a terrible title. And I feel really guilty because I'm talking about human rights, and obviously human rights are an incredibly serious matter, and it makes it seem like I'm trivializing human rights. And so forgive me for that. And also, in order to make this talk, I also have to do an incredibly boring thing, which is to define what hacking is, because otherwise you can't really make a proposition. And this is the kind of stuff I hate. I'm not an academic, so I have the privilege of doing stuff without needing to make exhaustive taxonomies to describe what I do. But the best I could come up with is that hacking is an individual changing their environment or experience via technology. Then I thought that's a bit restrictive, so let's say via technology or cunning. So technology is just cunning made concrete after all. And that works for me for this talk. So for me personally, I feel that all my life I've had the impulse to hack things. When I was a 5-year-old watching terrible UFO TV shows, I had a yearning to have a computer that I didn't really understand. And now I think we see the same thing with Minecraft, that Minecraft taps into some desire that some people have out of the wound to hack things. And I'm sure you know Minecraft is a kind of non-game where it's sort of like Patience turns out to be. There is no game, it's just playing it is the game. So to me, why I think hacking is important is if you define it as changing your environment, if you're in a place where you can't change your environment, that's prison, pretty much. And again, don't mean to trivialize prisons, sorry guys, but if you've ever been in that situation where you feel that your choices have been removed from you and that you can't have any influence on the world around you, it's the most debilitating mental situation to be in. So now I'm going to try this tricky thing. With that very boring intro of Hackability as Human Right, on to me. So this talk, Andrew encouraged me to talk about myself, so it's kind of my personal experiences, and therefore it's probably very inconsistent, and probably some bits of it might contradict some other bits. But like many of us in the room, I was a child of Lego, Star Trek, and Doctor Who. Aren't I lucky that all three of those things have still turned out to be phenomenally popular as I settle into middle age. And again, like many of you, I was, sorry, I shouldn't make assumptions, but I was the kind of kid at school, I learnt pi to 100 decimal places when I was 9, just to annoy my maths teacher. And now, of course, I think, what a clever maths teacher. But at the time, I thought, hey, I won. How brilliant. And I was lucky enough to get my first computer in 1978. And it's a Science at Cambridge MK14. This beautiful platonic rendering, I think, actually preceded them being able to produce the devices. It was Clive Sinclair's first thing that was announced and then took ages to come out. And as opposed to the, I think I've mislabeled the slides, oh, no, I have screwed up the slides. I did have a photograph of my MK14, and it's covered in solder. It honestly looks like a metal-eating robot has spilt its lunch all over it. And so it was at that moment that I learned that actually hardware wasn't my métier, and that perhaps it was software. For me, the computer that defined, I guess, my whole experience of working with them was the BBC Micro. And I was lucky enough to be interviewed on Southeast at 6 in 1983 by Laurie Mayer, a very unremarkable moment in the history of computing. But the thing that's awesome for me is it captures the incredible style of the era. And I wasn't going to make you sit through the whole video, but there are links if you wanted to. But Laurie Mayer is he's like Humphreys today on Radio 4. He barely conceals his contempt for the whole idea of computers. And I show him a little demo that I did, and he said, how long did that take you? And I said, it took about an hour. And he said, an hour to do that? And of course, I feel that I've got the last laugh, because today he is probably missending things on Instagram, because he doesn't understand. And what I'm actually here for is to talk about a computer game I wrote about Doctor Who. Amazing, but also very kind of random. Through the BBC Micro, I'd been writing computer articles for computer magazines and then computer books. I think now, at the same age, I'd just be writing blog posts and making YouTube videos, and you wouldn't even know that I was a teenager. But in my time at the BBC, I had this extraordinary thing where they decided to make a game for Doctor Who. They didn't, it was BBC Publications, the book publishers, so obviously they didn't know any computer people or games people. Oh, but we know Jeremy. Oh, we'll ask him. And so they asked me to write this game without actually bothering to check whether I like games. And actually, I'm a relatively unusual computer person in that I have absolutely no time for games whatsoever, apart from the brief 48-hour addiction I had to Tetris in 1992, but I think we all had that. But the thing that's really striking about this, all this stuff happened to me bloody years ago, and I couldn't wait for it to be over and to get on with adulthood. But what I've learned since is really surprising, that none of this has ever gone away. Just like punk rock didn't actually kill rock and roll, the rise of the IBM PC and the Mac and everything didn't kill the BBC Micro. When I was researching this, I found somebody who broadcast a live stream of them playing this blessed game in 2013 with their expletive-ridden commentary on, in fact, how terrible the game is. And it was reviewed last year in the Register. And a point I was going to make about the MK14 was how incredibly primitive it was. It came with 256 bytes of RAM and I think 512 bytes of ROM and an 8-digit LED display and a hex keypad. Ridiculous now when you consider that probably the headphone adapter of my iPhone has more computing power than that. But the thing I realized is actually I could have spent the last 30 years programming that machine because the hardware is pretty much equivalent to a modern-day smart card. So the challenge that we had then of how much cool stuff can you fit into 256 bytes of RAM, which I highly recommend as being an excellent way to spend the day, actually is still a commercially important, useful skill to have. And God, if only I'd known that at the time. The other shocking thing about this to me, and maybe it's not so shocking to those of you that are sufficiently young, but this was closer to the year of the Queen's coronation than to today. Which, okay, is just another way of saying I'm a really old guy. But it's also, I guess, it's just to remind us that we are in an industry with a deep and long history. One of the other opportunities that I got, and again, it says something about the amateurishness of Britain in the 80s, was to do these ident animations for BBC Children's TV. So from about 1983 to 85, I did a series of maybe 40 of these animations that would be, I'd go in and have lunch at BBC TV Centre with some old BBC producer. We'd have a bottle of claret and sit and chat, and then come up with some amazing idea like a spider. And then I'd go home and stay up all night. Have we got sound on here? Because there's some really awesome, terrible sound effects on this. I'm really pleased you had it on so loud, actually. And then there was, oh God. Okay.
In Think Again this afternoon, Johnny Ball discovers the fun behind the facts about photography when he captures the moments that developed from magic lanterns to moonshots. So if you want to snap out of it and get into pictures, join Johnny and Think Again at 4:35. Now on BBC One, William Ruston continues the story of the magic pudding.
And the reason why I kept that end bit in, even though I didn't realize it was going to be so incredibly loud, was I was obviously the beneficiary of, for a brief period, badly produced 8-bit graphics were incredibly fashionable. But isn't it weird that it actually overlaps with the period when the BBC were capable of producing beautiful photorealistic globes that rotated on their own? And this job was actually, the other remarkable thing about it was that it ended when I was replaced by Philip Schofield. So maybe the first time that a technologist has been replaced by Philip Schofield. We both smoked at the time, and we used to go and smoke in this place that we then later discovered was used for storing videotapes. And those of you who've worked in that field will know what a daft idea that was. So, after the time we'd just been talking about, I then did 20 years of corporate sort of IT, working for real-time telecoms software company, working for an investment bank, all the startups, all the kind of stuff that you get to do if you work in technology. And aren't we incredibly lucky that you can work in so many different fields? Sometimes it seems that the unifying thing about most of the places I've worked in is that they've been regulated industries. So, you know, I have the natural anathema that we all do to institutions, but regulated institutions are the very worst of the worst. But anyway, in 2004, I released a thing called TiddlyWiki, which was originally not an open source project, it was just a demo. And then you don't get to say how people treat the stuff that you do. Other people took this demo and said, oh, it's a great product, if only it did such and such. And then I had the experience I think a lot of people have had with open source, where you end up improving the thing and turning it into a product because it's actually less work than replying to all of the messages and whinging and hassle that you get. So I was in the fabulous position, really, of knowing nothing about open source, having spent all these years, as probably we all have, working with technology and musing at the ineffability of it and how simple technology seemed in my bedroom. And then suddenly when you moved me to an investment bank, the most trivial aspects of technology seemed to involve project plans and stuff that, you know, I'd never experienced before. But right from the beginning, I think I found it appealing, the idea that a computer should augment us. So Steve Jobs has this quote that therefore is probably stolen from somebody else, that a computer should be or could be a bicycle for the mind. And obviously, I'm sure we're all bicycling enthusiasts. Bicycles are literally magic to a machine that without any battery or anything suddenly lets you go further and harder. That's witchcraft, I think. And I love the idea that computers can do the same, that actually, you know, we are savanna animals that evolved to escape predators and catch fairly slow-moving prey. And so, yes, it's not surprising that we need help to undertake the kind of intellectually demanding and socially demanding tasks that we do every day. And so, you know, a lot of technology is propping up the advertising industry and God knows what else, the things that we might find embarrassingly commercial. But right at its heart, the thing that excites me is the potential for computers to make a difference to our individual lives. And of course, if you work with people who, disabled people, for instance, who have special needs for using software, you see just what a profound impact some of the stuff that we take for granted has. So I wasn't really going to go on about TiddlyWiki because you can find out about it, but there's some words there that will either baffle you or bemuse you or conceivably make you want to find out more. But I think TiddlyWiki is a response to a very specific version of that idea of augmenting us. And it's the idea that I've come to think that everybody thinks that they would be happier if they were more organized. And again, I'm probably doing what we all do, not being a scientist, I'm projecting from myself to other people. But still, it's what I've learned both in work and from working with TiddlyWiki. And that the quest for self-organization, for some people it's a very explicit thing and they read self-help books and so on. Some people think that they've got it nailed, but it's the urge. So I'm not saying personal organization is important, but the urge to personal organization, the belief that if you were more organized, you'd be happier. And maybe that's what lies behind all the new resolutions that you start in January. So TiddlyWiki responds to that urge. And the way that it does it is in a way that I think a lot of us as hackers would find appealing. It's a very simple mechanism that is endlessly reapplied to do everything that the software does. So at its heart, there's this little pipeline that converts the text that you write, markup text like Markdown, all the way through to a DOM and can do selective updates to it. And then the entirety of the thing is built like that, including, crucially, the user interface of it. So I'm a great admirer, bizarrely, of Excel. Back in the 90s, Excel ushered in this extraordinary era when the local lawyer or estate agent here would tinker around with Microsoft Access or Excel in the evenings and create a little custom system for handling whatever problems they've got. And I really liked that. You saw some crazy stuff. You saw stuff that barely looked like software. And you see the kind of progeny of that stuff when you go to the dentist and you see all that software that's on a really big screen because all the buttons are laid out, again, like a Technicolor yawn into... anyway, so what was I trying to say? Oh, yes. I'm so sorry. That Microsoft Office was this extraordinary hacking platform that people created. People with no programming skills created their own custom solutions to the problems that mattered to them. For me, it ended up being a kind of doomed golden age because all of those tools are wrapped around what for me feel like really old concepts, like we write on paper, and one sheet of paper follows another sheet of paper, and that seems like it's a faster horses thing, isn't it? That we introduce computers, and what's the first thing people try and do? But fake paper with them. Ooh, sorry. So I wanted to just show you a couple of things that people have done with TiddlyWiki. And I can't see my cursor. Can anybody see where my cursor is? There. Right, okay. So this one, can I make this a bit smaller font? Okay, this is a guy who is an academic. I was just being rude about academics. Not a developer. And he's adapted TiddlyWiki to be an academic note-taking tool. So he's got actually all the ingredients of being a great hacker. He's got crystal clear vision of what he wants to achieve. And he doesn't mind blind, brute force trial and error to get there. And TiddlyWiki has an unusual characteristic, which is that the entire application is in a single HTML file, which means that somebody like this guy he can't use Git, he doesn't use source code control, but he gets some of the advantages of it, because if he makes a radical alteration, he just needs to take a copy of the HTML file, put it to one side, and he knows that if he's messed up, he can revert to that old copy. And that's actually the safety net that as a developer, that's why you can develop drunk, because you know that you can always roll back. But civilians don't mess around with their Excel spreadsheets drunk because they don't have source code control. So to me, this is, and what he's done is he's taken the core functionality and he's added some sort of specific things. So here's a whole bunch of biographical records that get tacked on, and notes and comments and so on. So it's a way of combining, you've got a main entry about Shakespeare and then a way to attach all this structured information to it. And I think very explicitly, this is a person who's building an environment for them to do their thinking in. And it's an incredibly private thing. This is, people use, again, because of its single file nature, people use TiddlyWiki for stuff that they would never put on the public internet. Another cracking example is somebody who's done a choose your own adventure to problems with Git. And what I love about it is down here, you may be able to see that all problems in Git come down to fix a change or find what is lost. And so it just takes you down. So it's not even, in this case, he's not done any functional changes to it or anything, it's just content. But he's built a tool that anybody can use, and for people using the tool, the fact that it was built with TiddlyWiki is completely irrelevant. And if you're a software developer and I told you to build this, you wouldn't build TiddlyWiki. You'd just lash together some HTML. But the point is, the guy who did this couldn't have done that. This one is, somebody who went, again, I won't be able to operate it like this, but where they operated, they constructed a complete Zork-like adventure. So again, TiddlyWiki actually is part of something called Twine that you might have seen. That's a hypertext game authoring tool. So the engine that delivers, that presents the things that you make with Twine is TiddlyWiki. And it's obviously, when people see any kind of wiki, one of their first thoughts is often choose your own adventure. Here's a guy who is a hacker. He's a fourth hacker, yay, special badge. And again, look, all this stuff, PET 2001, yay. And this TiddlyWiki is automatically generated from the documentation. So somewhere, if I click in somewhere, you get a whole load of info. Oh, what was that? Yeah, fourth anyway. And this is, well, can anybody tell me what it is? It has many of the characteristics I really love. So it's in Russian and I can't understand it, and that's one of the wonders of working in open source is I collaborate with people that I can't talk to all the time. I think that in order to do a good job at what we do, probably in many fields, we need to remember that not everybody is like us. And it's quite a big deal. You think about the problems that cause ripples in the tech industry. I think I can ascribe that to people making that mistake, people thinking that everybody is like them. But it's impossible to work in this environment with this kind of stuff going on without getting your head around that. So this is a person who, not sure if from their name, I don't know their gender or anything, but they're in Russia. This is an online florist that has been created with TiddlyWiki, which is an insane thing to do, isn't it? But the reason, and the thing that they've done that's incredibly clever is the entire server is static. So when you raise an order, it actually posts something to, it's not getsatisfaction.com, but something like that, some existing web service that they discovered they could make a AJAX call to that it would log information that they could pick up later. Extraordinary amount of trouble to go to. But in fact, of course, a server is a cripplingly complicated thing for most people to manage and a very risky thing to manage. And so in fact, if you're not us, if you're not a geek, being able to work without a server, saving those costs and risks, is incredibly valuable. And then the final one I was going to show you that's my absolute favorite example at the moment. This is a PE teacher. I hated PE teachers. Sorry, I didn't hate PE teachers. I hated PE at school. But so therefore, what could be more amazing than getting an insight into how PE teachers think? So this person teaches volleyball to year 8 people in America. I'm not sure how old people are who are year 8. And in here, if I get this right, you can see, I should have right. So basically what it does is you can see you can add things to these kind of cards and you can create custom exercise cards for students that they can use to track their progress. What I love about it, as I say, is that I know nothing about volleyball. I know nothing about the challenges of teaching volleyball. They've done a beautiful job of, again, the same thing, of having a clear vision of what they want to build and then brute force bashing away until they get there. And what I really love is that there's bits of it that I kind of don't like. Like, I would never have made those buttons all different colors, and yet it's obviously terribly important to that person. And it makes me see that how fundamentally different this is to a blogging platform. So Blogger is a great platform for personal expression. Anybody can go there and create a blog as long as it looks like the 55 other blogs that are blog templates that are easily accessible. And so even though this ability to finally adapt things to your own unique needs is being applied to this rather strange area, it's beautiful and awesome that it can happen. And now more mouse losing. Here we go. All right. Oh, yes. And so there was to give for PE spot. So I kept this in because that video of the interview in 1983, at the same time that I was being made to feel stupid by the interviewer, these women were on the other side of the studio manhandling these cats. And it was contemplating them that, again, made me think this point about being closer to the coronation than today. And it's also, well, obviously, all presentations have to have cats in, don't they? So, what I've been trying to say is that hacking is an important urge for some people. Not everybody, but for some people. And that hacking, I think, is valuable for society. And the reason why it's valuable is actually an aspect of the same thing as open source. When you hack, if you fail, the cost of failure is embarrassment. But it's privatized just to you. Whereas if a big infrastructure project with an entire institution backing it goes wrong, then everything's up in the air. So it's a really basic point about open source, about why open source works. But I think it's reasonable to apply it to this whole notion of hacking as I'm defining it. But I worry about it a bit too, because, for instance, people who want to hack their iPhones, they have to jailbreak their phones, which is kind of cool. I've pulled that prison analogy before. So how awesome that being able to adapt to your iPhone actually uses the same metaphor. But you may know that almost all jailbroken iPhones are infected by malware. So it's not a simple equation. You know, as a techno-utopian hacking optimist, I think, yeah, everybody should have the right to hack personal consumer electronics that they own. But I realized I would never let a friend of mine jailbreak their phone based on what I know about the safety of the jailbreaking situation. And it seems really sad at the moment because, like the new Apple TV, it's a cheap device, but it's kind of, it reminds me when we used to read the HTML specs 20 years ago, and they used to talk about user agents that you haven't considered yet. And the Apple TV kind of could be that, because they've gone out of their way for it to not have a browser for quite good reasons, but it's clearly a web-connected device. Everything it does, I think, is over HTTP. And yet, it's closed, and if I want to jailbreak it, then the price will be Russian hackers knowing what I'm watching on TV. But then the optimist in me goes, well, hang on, Apple could establish a non-profit foundation whose purpose was to assist the jailbreaking community to be able to exercise their rights to hack the device safely. So, you know, whenever you see a problem in the field of commerce, I think we only need to be a little bit idealistic and optimistic to be able to think our way around it. Closing thoughts. I'm really torn between thinking that technology has moved ridiculously slowly. So many of the devices that we have today, we imagined these in 1977, trivially. I first saw a 300 dpi CRT in about 1987, an incredibly expensive thing, at a graphics show. And if you'd said to me then that I'd have to wait until 2013 to get a laptop with a Retina display, you know, that's nearly 30 years after laser printers came out and gave us a taste of what 300 dpi looked like. So in some sense, that really disappoints me, that it makes me feel, sugar, our lives aren't actually long enough to give us a really decent, you know, I'd like to go from the Industrial Revolution to about 1957, please, invention of the transistor. Then that would give me a good perspective on what's going on. But then again, I get even more depressed by another aspect of the same point, how predictable the changes are. So for instance, Thatcher was up before. Something I've been told about her is that she believed in scientists, that she was the last politician that we had who actually took the trouble to understand science and believe in scientists, and that the politicians that we've had since then have tended to surround themselves by business people. You know, they don't set so much store by science as Thatcher did. Whatever else you think about her, that was kind of, it was a good thing. It was, at the time, it was an environment in which the white heat of technology was still being celebrated in this kind of hangover from the 60s. But the distressing thing is that, say, you look at digitization of music. When I was 9 at school. I had a maths teacher who I was fiddling around with tape recorders and all that kind of stuff then. And he said, in the future, they'll have tape recorders with no moving parts. And I was like, oh, wow, will the tape move? And all this. And he explained. And of course, it happened. But we had to wait till 1998 until I think we first saw an MP3 player. And yes, it was utterly predictable. And in fact, everything that happened since then, in terms of the impact on the creative industries, is totally predictable. There were people talking about it in the 80s. And yet, my bête noire, Radio 4, I was listening to Radio 4 in 1990, 91, 92, that kind of time. What they covered in science was stem cell research and cloning, the kind of sci-fi dilemmas that make sense to somebody who doesn't have any understanding of science. And they're kind of fun to talk about because there's lots of literary allusions. You know, cloning, if you're a humanities graduate, is a wonderful subject. So I feel that we've been, as a society, really failed by our media. That so much of the stuff that we're party to, that's really obvious, and that actually has caused our friends and family great pain as they try and get their heads around the fact that they can no longer make money in the way that they could 30 years before. So that was my closing downbeat thought. My upbeat thought is to return to the thing I said before that I think is really comforting for me, that there's lots of people like me. There's lots of people like us. And one of the magics of doing TiddlyWiki is I get a very clear sense of that, because when people discover it, they often email me or post to the group. And one of the things that comes through is that they recognize in TiddlyWiki something of how they think their brain is organized. And in turn, what is there is what I've put in there of how I think my brain looks like. So it's a tiny bit like, you know, if you write a novel, one of the amazing things, if you then, which I haven't obviously, but if you then meet people who've read your novel, you're meeting people who've been inside your head. And that's a pretty interesting starting point for a relationship. And I get that with TiddlyWiki. I get to meet lots of people who kind of already know me in an amazing way. And so that, as I say, makes me confident there are plenty of people like me, but that it's terribly important to remember that not everybody is. And that our job is to build a world for the people who aren't like us. And now, hopefully, trying to make it all make sense. The point about TiddlyWiki that I was trying to show you is that it's a tool built by a hacker. It's a kind of standard. In fact, it's very much the sort of thing that hackers like to build. It's a world of its own, you know, and we're all very drawn to world building. But the thing that I now realize is significant about it is that it's acted as a substrate for other people to hack. So by creating, and I shouldn't claim this as a unique capability. These are snowflakes, these bits of software, but this one is my bit of software, and there's many others that have the same characteristic. But it's elevated the ability to do the kind of hacking that software people take for granted and put it in the hands of people who actually have problems that can be solved with those tools. And I think that's a pretty awesome thing when we get to do that, when we get to impact people outside our own little bubble of Doctor Who and Star Trek and Lego. So thank you very much. Sorry for the disorganized rambling, and I hope that was interesting. Thank you.